Imagine building an empire from the ground up, only to have the person you trusted most betray you. One night, my wife disappeared with her lover, taking more than just my trust. She stole money, company secrets, and nearly destroyed everything I had worked for. But what she didn't know, I saw it coming. And while she thought she was playing me, I was already setting the trap. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about revenge, power, and the brutal lesson I taught them when they tried to take what was mine. The numbers on the financial report were better than expected. Logan Mercer leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Mercer Tech was in a dominant position again, set to outperform competitors for another year. 2 decades of relentless work had built this empire, and he wasn't about to let anything shake it. The sharp vibration of his phone shattered his moment of triumph. His hand hovered over the device, ready to silence the call, until he saw the name on the screen, Briarwood Medical Center. A cold prickle ran down his spine. Hospitals didn't call for good news. "This is Logan Mercer," he answered, voice steady despite the sudden tightness in his chest. "Mr. Mercer, your son Ethan has been admitted with injuries. He's asking for you." Logan was already moving before the nurse finished speaking. He barely registered grabbing his keys, barely noticed the familiar streets passing in a blur. His mind raced ahead of him, cataloging possibilities. A car accident? A fight? Ethan was 19, careful, level-headed, but 19 nonetheless. There was no telling what trouble he could have stumbled into. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. Machines beeped, hushed voices murmured, and behind it all, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights pressed down like an unseen weight. Logan spotted his son immediately, slumped on an exam table, looking smaller than he ever had before. His left arm was in a cast, and deep bruises were already spreading across his face. Ethan looked up as Logan approached, his red-rimmed eyes heavy with something deeper than pain. "Dad?" His voice cracked, thick with emotion. Logan took in the details, the tremor in Ethan's hand, the way his fingers curled into the edge of the hospital bed as if grounding himself. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just an accident. "What happened?" Logan asked, keeping his tone even, controlled. Ethan swallowed hard. He hesitated, his throat bobbing. Logan waited. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes more powerful than words. Finally, Ethan forced out the words. "I saw Mom with someone else." The air in the room seemed to thin. Logan felt his fingers tighten around the side of the bed. He willed his expression to remain unreadable, but inside, something twisted. "She was with Ryan Holt." The name barely registered, until Ethan added the next part. "In your bedroom." For a moment, Logan's mind refused to process what he had just heard. "She didn't even seem to care that I was there," Ethan continued, his voice hollow. "I tried to leave, tried to call you. That's when Ryan came after me. He was drunk. He shoved me into the doorframe. My arm," he glanced down at the cast, "broke on impact." Logan inhaled slowly through his nose, his grip tightening. But Ethan wasn't finished. "Mom helped him." The words landed like a punch. "She locked me in the guest room while they left together." Logan's stomach turned. Not just infidelity. Not just betrayal. This was something far worse. He looked at his son, his only son, and saw the raw betrayal in his eyes. The quiet, unspoken question, "What are you going to do?" Logan placed a firm hand on Ethan's uninjured shoulder. "I'll handle it." His voice was low, steady. The same voice he used when making the kind of business deals that left competitors in ruin. Ethan exhaled shakily, nodding. He trusted his father. Logan Mercer was a man who got things done. If he said he would handle it, it would be handled. Logan left the hospital with his thoughts sharpened into a singular focus. His wife, Madeline, had been with another man in their home. Not just any man, but Ryan Holt, a neighbor, an associate, someone who had once been invited into their lives. But betrayal never came from strangers. It always came from those you let close. By the time he pulled into the driveway, Logan already knew this was bigger than infidelity. Something about this felt calculated. Too clean. Too precise. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. Logan moved through the rooms, taking in the evidence of a rushed departure. Open drawers. Missing clothes. Hangers discarded on the closet floor. The master bedroom reeked of betrayal, cheap cologne, and the stale remnants of stolen intimacy. In his home office, his suspicions hardened into certainty. The safe was open. Cash gone. Documents missing. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. His jaw tightened. It wasn't just a failed marriage. It was theft. His anger sharpened into something lethal. Logan Mercer wasn't just a husband who had been cheated on. He was a man who had been targeted. And that was a mistake Madeline and Ryan would regret. Logan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was an attack. And Madeline hadn't just left. She had taken what mattered. His mind moved through the facts like a machine: the emptied safe, the missing documents, the stolen cash. His wife and her lover hadn't just run off in a fit of passion. They had been planning this. The question was, why? Logan forced himself to breathe evenly. There was only one way to get answers. Find them. It didn't take long. Ryan Holt wasn't smart enough to cover his tracks. Logan knew where he lived. And right now, Logan had no intention of waiting. A confrontation with the traitors. The drive to Ryan's house was short, but it felt like a lifetime. Every street, every turn, was soaked in betrayal. When Logan pulled up, the sight in front of him confirmed everything. They were still here. Madeline and Ryan stood in the driveway, shoving suitcases into the trunk of Ryan's flashy, overpriced sports car. They moved with the ease of practiced familiarity, like a couple that had been doing this for far too long. Logan stepped out of his car, his movements slow, controlled. Measured. Going somewhere? His voice cut through the air like a blade. Madeline spun, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. Ryan, always the coward, tried to straighten his posture, puffing himself up as if that would somehow make him less pathetic. But Logan had already decided. He wasn't here to listen. Ryan opened his mouth to say something, but Logan's fist found his jaw first. The sickening crack of bone meeting bone was satisfying in a way that nothing else could be. Ryan stumbled back, blood already pooling at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't a fighter. He never had been. Logan stepped forward, looming over him. "You put your hands on my son!" Ryan spat blood onto the pavement. "You don't understand." Logan hit him again. This time, Ryan went down completely. Madeline let out a sharp gasp, but she didn't move to help him. Logan turned to her next, his stare colder than she had ever seen. "We're done," he said, voice devoid of emotion. "Don't bother coming home." For a brief moment, something flickered in her expression: regret, uncertainty. But it vanished just as quickly. She had already made her choice. As Logan turned to leave, he caught something, a hushed exchange between the two traitors. Ryan, still groaning, muttered through gritted teeth, "This wasn't part of the plan. We need those files." Madeline's eyes widened, and she snapped at him, voice sharp and urgent. "Shut up! He might hear you!" But Logan had already heard. His blood ran cold. Files? A plan? This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about his company. A bigger threat emerges. Logan sat in his office, staring at the space where his documents used to be. His instincts had been right. The betrayal ran deeper than he imagined. He reached for his phone, dialing the one person he trusted with this information: Frank Carter, Quantum Innovations' top legal advisor and his closest ally. Frank picked up immediately. "Logan? You okay?" Logan exhaled slowly. "I think my wife just tried to steal my company." A pause. Then Frank's voice came back, lower, serious. "Tell me everything." Logan laid it out: the affair, the attack on Ethan, the missing documents, the strange conversation he overheard. By the time he finished, Frank's tone had shifted. "Logan, this isn't just about a divorce," Frank said carefully. "If they were after your company, someone bigger is involved." Logan pinched the bridge of his nose. "That's what I'm starting to realize." A heavy silence filled the line before Frank spoke again. "Listen. We need to lock down Quantum Innovations, now. If those files contained critical company data, this could be an inside job." Logan's stomach twisted. His personal life was already in ruins. But this was war. And Logan Mercer had never lost a war before. The first warning. As Frank started putting security measures in place, Logan's phone buzzed with an unknown number. A text message. "Back off, Mercer. Walk away now, or everything you've built comes crashing down." Logan stared at the screen. They thought they could threaten him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Logan sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. The words of the anonymous text burned into his mind. "Back off, Mercer. Walk away now, or everything you've built comes crashing down." A threat. A warning. But Logan Mercer wasn't a man who backed off. If anything, this only confirmed what he had already suspected. This wasn't just about Madeline and Ryan. Someone bigger was pulling the strings. The pieces were coming together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Who was behind this? How long had it been in motion? And most importantly, what was their endgame? If they thought one cryptic message would make him retreat, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Logan had spent decades building Mercer Tech from the ground up. He wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers because of some unseen threat. He made 2 calls that night. The first was to Frank Carter, his company's top legal advisor and one of the few people he still trusted. If someone was trying to sabotage the company from the inside, Frank would find the cracks. The second call was to Ruby Vaughn, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up dirt no matter how deep it was buried. She didn't deal in pleasantries. When she answered, her voice was sharp, direct. "What's the job?" "I need everything on Ryan Holt and Madeline Mercer," Logan said, his voice steady. "Financials, contacts, anything suspicious. Someone is backing them, and I want to know who." There was a brief pause, then Ruby's response came, laced with quiet confidence. "Give me 48 hours." Logan ended the call and exhaled slowly. He didn't like waiting, but this required precision. Every step had to be calculated, controlled. If he moved too fast, he might miss the bigger picture. If he moved too slow, they might get ahead of him. The next morning, he arrived at Mercer Tech only to find his business partner, Lawrence King, already waiting in his office. The look on his face told Logan that something was wrong. "We've got a problem," Lawrence said as he dropped a thick folder onto Logan's desk. Logan flipped it open and scanned the numbers inside. Unapproved transactions, money moving between accounts that shouldn't have been touched. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Someone was bleeding the company dry, siphoning funds in a way that would be almost untraceable if they hadn't been caught this early. "These numbers don't add up," Lawrence said, his voice low. "Whoever is doing this is smart. It's subtle, spread out over different accounts so nothing triggers alarms. But over the last few months, millions have been moved." Logan's jaw tightened. This wasn't sloppy work. It was deliberate. Coordinated. "Who has access?" he asked. "That's the problem," Lawrence said. "Whoever did this covered their tracks. We're running a trace, but it could take time." He hesitated before adding, "If this gets out, our shareholders will panic. If investors start pulling out, we could be looking at a hostile takeover." Logan absorbed the information, his mind already working through the implications. This wasn't just corporate theft. This was an attack. And if Lawrence was right, the ultimate goal wasn't just to hurt Mercer Tech, it was to take it. "Lock everything down," Logan ordered. "Change access codes, freeze all non-essential transactions. I don't want a single dollar moving without my approval until we know exactly who's behind this. Lawrence nodded and left to carry out the orders. Logan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His personal life had already been thrown into chaos, but now his business, his empire, was under attack too. Later that night, as he combed through more company records in his home office, his phone buzzed with a message from Ruby. Found something. You're not going to like it. Meet me at your house. Logan wasted no time. When he pulled into his driveway, he immediately noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. Ruby's. She didn't do house calls unless it was important. Inside, he found her waiting in his office, holding up a small device no bigger than a button. Know what this is? She asked. Logan frowned. A tracker? Close, she said, placing it on his desk. It's a listening device. His entire body went rigid. There were 3 more just like it, Ruby continued. Your house has been bugged. Logan's mind raced. Someone had been listening to him. For how long? How much had they heard? What else do you have? He asked, his voice colder than steel. Ruby pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. Your wife has been making large cash withdrawals for months. Hundreds of thousands. And it wasn't just for her. She's been moving it into offshore accounts. Logan clenched his jaw. For who? That's where it gets interesting, Ruby said. She's connected to someone high up. Someone with real power. I don't have a name yet, but I will. A knock at the office door interrupted them. Logan turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. Dad, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I think I knew something was wrong with Mom. I should have said something sooner. Logan's anger softened just slightly. He motioned for his son to come in. Tell me everything, he said. Ethan sat down and started talking. The secret phone calls. The strange men visiting when Logan was away. The way Madeline suddenly became interested in his father's work, asking questions about things she had never cared about before. Logan listened carefully, piecing it all together. His wife hadn't just been cheating. She had been working against him. And now, thanks to Ruby's investigation, he knew Ryan and Madeline weren't the real threat. They were just the front line. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone powerful enough to plan a full-scale attack against Mercer Tech. Logan exhaled, his thoughts sharp and cold. They think they have me cornered, he said finally. Ruby leaned against the desk, arms crossed. So what's the play? Logan's eyes darkened. We set a trap. Logan Mercer had spent years outmaneuvering competitors, anticipating threats before they had the chance to strike. But this time, the attack had come from inside his own home. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic, calculated. His wife and her lover had been working against him for months, but they weren't the real masterminds. Someone else was behind it, someone powerful enough to move money without detection, to manipulate people like chess pieces, to plant listening devices in his own house. They thought they had him trapped. They thought he wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. The moment Ruby uncovered the surveillance in his home, Logan knew exactly what had to be done. If they wanted to listen, he'd give them something worth hearing. That evening, he called Lawrence, speaking just loud enough for the hidden microphones to catch every word. The script was simple. A major deal was in motion, one that, if completed, would triple Mercer Tech's value overnight. The documents were being prepared, but before anything could be finalized, they needed to be secured at his house. It was a lie. There was no deal. No billion-dollar acquisition. But Logan wasn't looking for buyers, he was looking for thieves. That night, his house became a trap. Cameras covered every angle, microphones were set to capture even the slightest movement, and Ruby and her team monitored the feeds from an off-site location. Logan waited in the shadows of his living room, his body coiled with anticipation. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, the first signs of movement appeared on the screens. 2 figures approached the back gate, moving carefully but with familiarity. Madeline and Ryan. They didn't hesitate. They knew where they were going, where the documents would supposedly be hidden. Inside, they worked quickly, each motion rehearsed. Ryan moved toward the safe, fingers fumbling with the lock, while Madeline inserted a USB drive into Logan's computer. She had always known where the most valuable files were kept. Logan stepped forward, switching on the lights. Madeline froze, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Ryan barely had time to react before Logan struck. The impact sent him staggering back, blood already pooling at the corner of his mouth. He groaned, disoriented, grasping for something, balance, words, anything that would get him out of this. But there was nothing to say. Madeline turned, eyes wide. For the first time, she looked afraid. She had expected an easy escape, a clean break, but instead, she had walked straight into a wall. The woman who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, who had once sat beside him at shareholder meetings and played the role of the devoted wife, now stood exposed. There were no more secrets left to hide. Ryan, still gasping, muttered something under his breath. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a groan, but the words carried weight. We weren't acting alone. Logan's breath remained steady, but inside, something clicked into place. They had always been too sloppy to pull this off alone. Someone else was behind this, someone bigger. The money, the offshore accounts, the hidden transactions, Madeline and Ryan had only been tools in a much larger game. For a brief moment, silence settled between them, thick with realization. Then Madeline moved. Logan saw it too late. Her fingers darted toward Ryan's jacket, reaching for something concealed in the inner pocket. A second later, cold steel flashed in the dim light. She had never been the impulsive type, never reckless. But desperation made people unpredictable. A single gunshot shattered the stillness. Madeline staggered backward, her body hitting the desk as her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. One hand pressed against her shoulder, blood seeping through the fabric of her blouse. She tried to speak, lips forming silent words, but the pain drowned out everything else. Logan turned toward the doorway. Ethan stood there, the gun still raised in his trembling hands. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wild with adrenaline. He had always been careful, controlled, but now he looked like someone seeing the world clearly for the first time. The weight of what had just happened settled over him. The gun shook slightly before his fingers loosened around the grip, letting it drop to the floor. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, cutting through the darkness. Madeline, still clutching her wound, barely lifted her head. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't even angry. Her expression was something else entirely, resignation. As the officers stormed in, guns drawn, she exhaled a slow, shaky breath. "It doesn't end with us," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the chaos. But Logan wasn't listening anymore. Ryan was dragged to his feet, groaning as officers restrained him. Madeline was lifted onto a stretcher, her fate no longer in her hands. Ethan stood motionless, his eyes locked on the ground. He had spent weeks wrestling with the truth about his mother, trying to reconcile the woman who had raised him with the person she had become. Now, he understood. There was nothing left to save. As the chaos settled and the officers took them away, Ethan finally looked up at his father. Logan's expression was unreadable, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. The people who had tried to take him down had made their move. Now it was his turn. The world moved fast after the arrests. News outlets swarmed the story, plastering images of Ryan Holt and Madeline Mercer being escorted out of Logan's estate in handcuffs. Their faces were everywhere, on every screen, in every headline. Ryan, bloodied and beaten, refused to look at the cameras. Madeline, paler than he had ever seen her, clutched her injured shoulder, her expression hollow. The media painted them exactly as they were, criminals who had tried to dismantle an empire and failed spectacularly. But Logan didn't waste time watching the fallout. His focus was already on the next battle. Because Ryan and Madeline had never been the real enemy. They were just tools in someone else's hands. The true threat had yet to be dealt with. Inside the boardroom at Mercertech headquarters, Frank Carter and Lawrence King waited with grim expressions. The air was thick with tension as Frank laid a thick stack of documents onto the table. "This goes deeper than them," he said. Logan had expected as much. Ryan and Madeline had neither the intelligence nor the influence to stage an attack of this magnitude. "We traced the missing funds," Frank continued. "They weren't just stealing from you, they were funneling money into shell corporations. And those corporations?" He flipped to another page, pointing to a familiar name. "They all trace back to Calhoun Holdings." Logan barely blinked. He knew Calhoun well. A multinational investment firm that thrived on devouring corporations from the inside out, gutting them, selling the pieces, and moving on. They were calculated, ruthless. Exactly the type to play the long game. Their plan was simple, Lawrence added. They wanted to tank Mercertech's stock, let investor confidence collapse, and then swoop in, buying up controlling shares before anyone could stop them. They were coming for everything. Logan glanced at the documents, flipping through them quickly. His mind processed the information like a machine. They were close, Frank admitted. Madeline's offshore accounts were designed to launder company funds in a way that would make Mercertech look like the guilty party. If we hadn't stopped them, it would have been your name tied to the financial crimes, not hers. Logan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the polished surface of the table. A carefully orchestrated destruction of his empire. It had been precise, methodical. And yet they had failed. But failure wasn't enough. Not for Logan. They had started a war. Now, he would finish it. Over the next few weeks, Logan executed his counterattack with the same cold efficiency he had built his company on. First, he went public. A controlled press conference laid out the facts, how his company had been targeted, how financial sabotage had been attempted, and how, through decisive action, Mercertech had remained standing. By the time the media absorbed the full picture, investor confidence had not only stabilized but soared. Second, he worked with federal investigators. The Financial Crimes Unit dug deeper into the shell corporations, unearthing the direct connection to Calhoun Holdings. That was all Logan needed. With the government now involved, regulatory audits followed. Subpoenas were issued. Investigations expanded. Within a month, Calhoun's stock began to plummet, board members resigned, and their name became synonymous with corporate fraud. Logan didn't just protect Mercertech, he buried the company that had dared to come after him. Meanwhile, Madeline's trial was unavoidable. It was a media sensation, a spectacle that the press ate up. She sat in the defendant's chair, no longer the composed, poised woman she had once been. The prosecution laid out everything: the embezzlement, the fraud, the conspiracy. The methodical betrayal. She had spent months weaving a web of deceit, but in the end, she hadn't been careful enough. The jury delivered the verdict swiftly. Guilty. She barely reacted. No outbursts. No tears. Just quiet acceptance. Logan sat in the back of the courtroom, unmoved. This wasn't victory. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was simply the final page of a story that had ended the moment she chose to betray him. Ryan took a plea deal, 15 years in federal prison. Madeline? She would never be free again. In the weeks that followed, Mercertech didn't just recover, it expanded. Investors, reassured by Logan's leadership, doubled their stakes. The company's value soared, outpacing competitors. Logan had taken an attempted downfall and transformed it into a rebirth. And through it all, Ethan remained by his side. His son had changed. The events of the last few months had hardened him, sharpened his instincts. He no longer carried the wide-eyed uncertainty of someone who still saw the world as fair. He had learned what it meant to protect what was his. One evening, as they stood in Logan's office, overlooking the glowing skyline of the city, Ethan broke the silence. "I always thought Mom loved us," he murmured, his voice distant. Logan didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied his son, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes held a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Ethan wasn't the same boy who had walked into that hospital room weeks ago, shaken and betrayed. He had been reforged in fire. She made her choices, Logan said finally. We made ours. Ethan nodded, understanding what was left unsaid. They weren't just survivors. They were Mercers. Months passed. The world moved on. Mercer Tech grew stronger than ever. One evening, as Logan sat in his study, a final letter arrived. The envelope sat unopened for hours before he finally decided to read it. It was from Madeline. The message inside was short, her once elegant handwriting slightly unsteady. I never meant for it to end this way. I only wanted more. More than just being your wife. More than just Mercer Tech. I thought I was outsmarting you, but in the end, I was the fool. You always win. I see that now. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Logan read it twice. Then, without hesitation, he tossed the letter into the fireplace. He watched as the flames consumed the paper, curling the edges until nothing remained but ash. There had been a time when he might have cared. When he might have felt something other than cold certainty. But he no longer had space for regret. He had once wondered if revenge would be enough. If taking back what was his would satisfy the betrayal that had been inflicted on him. Now he knew the truth. The best revenge wasn't destruction. It was success. And Logan Mercer always won.